One thing that's been so exciting, I think, about this new form of organizing is that it's in some ways led quite naturally to other forms of political organizing, both sort of formal are for candidates, but also around particular issues, ballot initiatives, this kind of thing.
Yes, and there again, those are forms of organizing in which women have historically led and which have now come to the surface. So organizing in the community around community issues and then turning those issues into political issues is, of course, a strategy that was used by the settlement movement in the progressive period of American history. And now we see those community forms of organizing most prominently around schools and education, but also in many other spheres, rents, evictions, housing discrimination, and so on. I love it that women have been able to create alliances, sometimes across class lines, across racial lines in this instance, but almost always along gendered lines. That it is women who've led these movements and have proposed that communities isolate the issues, sometimes a single issue, sometimes 2 or 3 issues, and then that they've injected those issues into political campaigns and you might say bullied or encouraged political leaders who may or may not be women to support them. And as we've seen in this recent election, they've run candidates who support their local initiatives.
And you mentioned schools, which are, of course, near and dear to my heart. And the organizing in the public sector over the last decade has been fascinating. On the one hand, the public sector labor movement has long been a source of stable jobs and advancement for women, particularly women of color. On the other hand, we've seen this massive assault from the right, coordinated in many respects at the legislative and judicial level, and leading to new right-to-work laws at the state level, and of course the Janus decision. And so this kind of assault has demanded a new kind of organizing. And again, I think women have taken the lead in rethinking what a public sector labor movement might look like.
Yes, not only taken the lead, but also demonstrated in charge of it. And here, of course, the experience in Wisconsin is the one that comes to mind. But I think the issue of public sector unionization is intriguing, partly because public sector unionism conflates a large variety of unionizing kinds of activities. So I think about Wisconsin, for example, and about the recent demonstrations of teachers in half a dozen different states, all of them asking for better wages, but also classroom conditions to be improved. And the wages, in some sense, have been secondary to the resources which teachers feel they've been denied. Now, those teachers, those who are, many of them organized in public sector unions, often don't have collective bargaining rights, or the rights are sort of given by virtue of a state waiver of some kind. But as in New York, for example, they can bargain collectively, but they don't have the right to strike, which of course is the weapon that unions use. But distinguish those public sector unions in which women are often a majority, so I'm thinking of teachers and clerks and so on, from the firemen and the police officers, also public sector unions, but often far more powerful and often still able to use, even if they've been denied the right to strike, they still use the mechanisms of the strike, the slowdown and so on. Now, in the Wisconsin experience, you might say the men supported the women, but in the end, the men, the male unions, were bought off, segregated. The governor of the state of Wisconsin allowed them to maintain their collective bargaining rights, but deprived the public sector unions, particularly the teachers' union, of the same right. I suppose I should conclude by saying that backfires, or at least I hope it backfires. I think it probably backfires more often than not, because teachers, as we've seen in the last year or two, have become increasingly militant and increasingly insistent that government pay attention to the issues that they're raising. And I suppose it would be fair to say that those are some of the umbrella issues we're concerned with. So it's teachers who've raised issues about, for example, homelessness among students, that the number of homeless students is increasing and that it's impossible to ask those homeless students to do the kinds of work that people with, a kitchen and a parent can manage to handle. That it's teachers who've raised the question of whether the austerity budgets, which deny teachers the basic materials that they sometimes need, pencils and pens. It's the teachers who are saying, wait a minute, these austerity budgets have gone too far. It's the teachers who have been wondering about whether the privatization of some schools, as in charter schools, where the teachers are not responsible to either a union or to a city government, but are responsible only to themselves and need to make money in a private corporation, whether moving in that direction, privatization in general, is a good idea or not a good idea. So these are all ways in which women's issues become much more general than affecting just women's lives alone.
And something you said there at the end raises another set of questions about potential divides among women. One thing I think was so inspiring to see in the West Virginia uprising was that you had teachers, not just as professional teachers, but working with public sector workers in schools up and down the chain, both to plan for communities, what would happen when they were on strike, how students would get food and health care and access to school buildings, but also really defining themselves as part of a broad movement of communities and workers. And I think of this because one place where teacher unions have often been criticized is for emphasizing their professionalism. And I think if we look at the women's movement, we might also say a similar critique has sometimes been leveled against the elite and professional women in that movement.
That's true, but indeed, I don't know whether teachers would be considered elite and professional women. I don't think so either. But what was astonishing about that West Virginia strike were the photographs of teachers making food for children who normally got free lunches at school, and they would provide the breakfasts and lunches for the children because that's what the children expected. Or children who were normally kept in after-school programs because their mothers or parents worked. And the teachers nevertheless continued to provide these kinds of after-school options, sometimes in their own homes for children. So you're right, this sense of teachers as part of a community and of defending the community so that the community didn't get divided against the teachers, didn't become hostile to the teachers. That's a woman's pattern of organizing. And one could say that that also dates back to the early 20th century garment strikes, for example, where women who were young women, often out working, would go on strike, and their contributions to the families would mean that there wasn't enough food in the family to eat. So it was women's groups, in that case, elite women often, that provided a little extra income for the family so that the family wouldn't suffer and the strike could continue. I love that kind of organizing, the sense that the organizing isn't simply for the benefit of higher wages. Samuel Gompers, founding head of the American Federation of Labor, used to say, when he was asked what do workers want, he used to say more. And I don't think women who are being organized would say that. I mean, of course they want good and adequate wages, but it's not more they want. It's a different kind of conception of the relationship between workers and their unions.